Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Maria Cassis. I'm the founder of Product of Things. I'll tell you a little bit about what we do, why we are here, the essence of Product of Things. We will meet a wonderful speaker, somewhat even a leader in our domain of product management for IoT and the enablers of this domain. And we're going to have a fascinating night, okay? So what is Product of Things is all about? Most of the people in the room, I say most because there are some new faces, which is a great thing for me as a community manager to see new people that are joining our community. For us people in this space, managing products in the IoT domain, we have many obstacles, sometimes challenges, sometimes things that are bigger than challenges, because we have to deal not only with the management and creation of new things in our domain, we actually have to face with two domains, right? There is the tangible aspect of what we do, there is the hardware, and there is the software. So Product of Things is the first community in the whole world for product managers specialize in this challenge. People that every single morning go to the office and think how to bring a new thing to the world that someone not can only spend their time with, but hold and enjoy. So this is Product of Things. My name is Maria Cassis. I'm the founder of Product of Things. I'm a product management consultant specialized in hardware and IoT. And today, I think it's one of the most fascinating meetups we ever had. Everybody is talking about how to create something that is bigger than the sum of its parts. Because these days, it's not about how you create value by yourself. It's about the group effort that brings something bigger to the table and to the users. So today, we have a special meetup. When we're talking about product management for IoT, we talk about software, we talk about hardware, we talk about big companies, and we talk about startups. And the best person to bring here now to talk about this critical and fascinating issue, okay, is Travis Bogard, Senior Vice President and Samsung Next and Head of Product. So please, Travis, join us. Thank you for joining us. We will start with a short chat about what ecosystem is all about, right? We just dived into this term without actually explaining why are we here. Then Travis will share from his experience. Now, I told you he's the right guy because he's hardware, software, startups, and corporate. So Jawbone, Uber, Microsoft. We'll dive into it in a minute. And that's it. We're going to have a little chat. Please, after the session, we'll have Q&A. So this is your time to think about questions for Travis. Okay, he's here to answer. So show him your Israeli chutzpah and ask about, the real stuff behind the terms. So let's dive in. Ecosystem is a term we all know from biology class, okay? That we high-tech people kind of stole into our terminology. It's about how a part can join something that is bigger than it, okay, in an ecosystem. And just by joining, it may increase the possibility of surviving, but at the same time, the whole ecosystem, because of the fact of having a few parts to it, increase the possibility of surviving as well and creating a bigger value. Now, how do you translate ecosystem into what we do day to day? Working?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So I think that's a great description, which is, how do you sort of think about the individual parts connecting up and laddering to something bigger than itself? And I think, when we talk about things like the Internet of Things, what is unique about that really comes down to not just that you now have connectivity and these things can talk to each other, but the point is, how and why can they go create an experience. And so, the thing that I started to see as we started to live in this world where we carried around these little supercomputers in our pocket, and we have the network that we're connected to, and that became high speed, and we had massive processing in the cloud, and then lots of other things around that start to do that. You start to say, how do these experiences that used to be bought as a single siloed product, the way we used to think about hardware, what you'd buy in a store, now starts connecting together, and when they come together, something magical, something different comes together. And so that's kind of how I start to think about the ecosystem, is what are those experiences you want to have come together, and how do those all ladder up with all these different parts to then create this unique whole. And so that's the areas that are interesting to explore, I think.
This is fascinating. To me, I think the most valuable definition I found for ecosystem was how product managers can see value provision and value creation as separated. Because these days, you can offer your users value and you actually had nothing to do with that, just by joining or by creating an ecosystem. And for us product managers, this is crucial because we actually don't have to do anything. You can stay at a hotel somewhere. You don't even need to go to the office, right? But you created something that for your users is valuable.
Yeah, and I think if you sort of think about, a lot of times we get sort of obsessed with the technology, the thing that we can go create, and we sort of end up in that path. I kind of think that the best products come from the very opposite lens, which is what's a problem you want to go solve in the world, and how do we go solve it? And as a creator, you should ultimately want to implement the least amount of stuff to go deliver that experience. Sometimes it might be the simple act of better explanation of things that already exist. It could be the curation and the convening of a number of things that exist connected together. Sometimes, and usually, there's some bridge that needs to be built. It could just be a software bridge that makes them work together in a very seamless way. And then very often what we're finding in a lot of the Internet of Things is often there's one critical hardware component that's missing that makes it not quite accessible. So if you think about something like Google Assistant, voice has been around for a long time. One of the companies that I was part of was a company called Tell Me Networks, and in the late 90s we were doing speech recognition and tell me my favorites and read me the news, stuff like that. One of the critical things we always talked about was how could you create a little piece of hardware that would make that accessible. And what we've seen in the past few years is as Alexa has manifested in Echo, and as Google Assistant's manifested in Google Home, as Bixby is showing up on devices, and as seen at CES is showing up in more devices, you start to get to a place where now all of a sudden it's accessible and able to make happen. And we've seen that with all these things that SmartThings is doing, is that physicality of pressing a button or touching something all of a sudden lights up a broader experience. And so I think that that's where things start to become interesting, is like it all connects together by building that minimal amount of stuff to connect it as one experience. And I think you only get there if you start from the experience and then say, what all already exists, why aren't people using it, and how do I complete that experience and tie it together?
I like it. So most of the times when you go to conferences, you first know what this person done in their life, their resume, and then you hear their thoughts. And here we choose to do it the other way around, first to understand what our Travis thought about this domain and about this challenge, and now we get to know his resume. So tell us more about yourself.
I've been fortunate enough to spend a lot of time in early creation of new categories. So spent a lot of time, early part of my career was at AOL. I was part of the early founding team of AOL Instant Messenger and building the software that when you would put a disk into your computer, those ones that used to get mailed around the world, it would all figure out how do you get online and get you connected. So started out on the development engineering side, doing things there. Moved into a lot of strategy, kind of helping our teams, bridge the deals. and then ended up part of doing due diligence on buying Netscape. And so that kind of migrated me into Silicon Valley from Dulles, Virginia. And through that process, ended up meeting a bunch of people who went and founded Tell Me Networks, and that's what led me into speech. Again, started out managing from an engineering perspective, and moved into product management from there, and then into sales engineer type role, into sales for many years. And then joined this company called Jawbone, which was creating new hardware categories. So headsets and what we thought of as wearable computing, sensors right on the body to speak to the Jambox Bluetooth speaker, and then wearables around the wrist for tracking health. And then most recently was at Uber, managing the B2B enterprise unit, essentially making it easier for people to ride Uber for the point of business.
Nice. Okay, so ecosystem.
Yep.
Can you please share with us an example from your career for an ecosystem? And what I'm really curious about is how the ecosystem product management affected the overall product strategy. Because it's nice to talk about strategy for, ecosystem is one, and another separated thing, like the overall product strategy of a company. So how did the one affect the other?
So, almost everything I've done since really started building products has been ecosystem driven. So many examples, but I think the number of examples from Jawbone as an example. So when I joined, the company was building just headsets, and that was the starting spot of the experience. And the vision that the company had since the beginning, which actually started around '99, was the same one we had at Tell Me. Which was what happens. How many people have seen that movie, Her? Looks like pretty much everyone, right? So in that movie, the whole idea is you have this little assistant, this little person, this computing interface that's all controlled from this little bud that goes into the ear. That was the idea that Tell Me had. It was the idea that Jawbone had, and truthfully, both were going at the same idea, but just starting in very opposite directions. One was starting at the software and the service that you want to build. The other was starting at the hardware to enable solving some of those basic problems. And so when partly what drew me to go to Jawbone in the late 2000s was it was this alignment of this vision, but getting to jump onto the other side. So one of the things that we wanted to build was actually, could we bring to life that experience? The ability to press a button here and say, what's the weather? Press a button and say, read me what's on Twitter. And could we actually make that possible? And keep in mind, this was right at the cusp of the smartphones having just come out. And so we wanted to create that, but we didn't want to build a huge software development team that's going to go build all of that. You're talking probably hundreds and hundreds of people to go build all the different apps and services that we could go create. And so what we did was we said, we're going to deliver that experience, but we're going to do it through a combination of partners. So what we built was the headset then had the ability to kick off on the phone to dial a telephone number. And then there was a software experience that you could program that, and there were a lot of different telephone numbers it could call. One was a service that would read you your email while driving. Another was a service that would tell you the news, weather, sports, and customized news. And so there were about 8 different companies that were all part of this. So when we launched our product, we had our little product, the Jawbone headset sitting on a shelf, and it said it can read you your email in your ear, it can read you Twitter, it can call friends, all hands-free. And it was doing this on top of and in partnership of all of these different third parties. And we were able to do that with very little development effort. And at the end of the day, they saw benefit, and they were doing press releases. Each one of those partners were saying, hey, now this works, go get the latest headset. So we got hundreds of millions of media impressions through all these different partners talking about us. At the same time, we were telling this very broad story about computing on the ear and voice as an interface. So that's one example where essentially this entire ecosystem, and it was very rewarding for each. We all benefited each other.
Interesting. So Product of Things is a community for product managers specializing in the more tangible objects in our day-to-day. And one of the challenges in this domain is that there are no many knowledge-sharing platforms out there talking about strategy or anything that has to do with the creation of tangible products. So my question for you is, was there a moment when you said ecosystem is fascinating, but it's not for us as we do hardware? Was there a moment you said, this is for the software guys?
Not for me. Not in
That's
that.
a good sign.
Yeah, and a lot of it came down to really that strong belief of here's what we want to go create, but also the reality of how can we go do that without in a short amount of time and as a without spending a lot of money. And so I think that necessity of doing that said, the only way to go practically do this is to leverage other parties. Now, I think for me, the point at which I started thinking about this really was a point where I also had enough experience that I had kind of gotten out of that phase of I can go build anything. Of course, we can all go build anything. The challenge, the place I'd gotten to was, sure, we can, but I've done this before. I know how long this is going to take. We're never going to actually ship, and I'm not going to be able to compete with all these other people if I'm trying to do 100 different things. So, I think I kind of hit that point at the time where I'd had enough experience to realize that that's in your head and not in practice. So, I think that was one bit. And then I think the other thing that was unique is having been in a BD role in the past, having built stuff before, we set up product very differently. Product ran both the product we were trying to build, but also we had BD as part of what we're part of our organization. So when I was going to do deals, it was me essentially saying, hey, how am I going to bring stuff in? Not BD people over the side coming and saying, hey, you should go do this deal. So it was very ingrained into the team structure that we had actually created as well.
So what made you realize this is the right way and actually there is no other way is the fact you kind of you've been to any role in the company one way or another to realize that, hey, I can explain the BD or the sales or the marketing person why this is the right way, and I can actually answer this person questions before they've been asked.
That's exactly right. And immediately as I was simultaneously thinking of here's the product experience we want to go create, I was also thinking about these are the terms that we're going to have each of the partners sign up, what the trade back and forth is, so we could actually make it an interesting incentive model for everyone involved. And a lot of that really came from having sat in the seat of building and doing deals before, where I was really thinking a lot about what's their problem, why would they go do this? Well, they don't have no one's finding them. They need marketing leverage. If I can tell you, hey, you're going to be in 100,000 points of sale sitting around the world with a box that has your logo on it, seems pretty interesting. And in fact, back in the day, Google, when they were trying to get a lot of recognition for local search, so we used to use Google just to search for websites. One of the things they were trying to become known for was searching for a local business, essentially, Benedict's next door, right? So you'd search for that. They went to all the carriers and convinced them, take these little cards, put them on the shelves so that people would start to do that, and they were having to spend money to do that from a customer acquisition. So I said, great, I have something on the shelf, I'll give you that in return. So connecting that whole value system so it's a win-win, or as I think about as win-win-win, the customer, our partner, and ourselves, ultimately led to those being successful partnerships.
Do you feel you can say that it actually made you a better product person? The fact that you sat in many sides of the table, you've been to engineering, marketing, sales, biz dev. Can you say that?
Absolutely. I think for two reasons. One is ultimately, when you're building stuff, you have to know how much you're pushing the team. And ultimately you want to get to the team to a place of outsized return for their effort. And so from one hand, having built stuff myself, I know that this is not all easy. And then having sat on trying to go sell this allows me to then understand what's going to work. So when I go and say, we absolutely need to build this, we need this flexibility, a lot of that came down to knowing how are we going to go sell and position this to the press, to the partners, and to the customers. And if we know how we're going to go do that, then that helps drive priorities on what we go build on the other side.
This is an interesting point. In Israel, I'll say like 50% of the product managers come with engineering background. They kind of like wanted the more action part of what they do, yeah? Go engineers. The other half is people from design or marketing, and it's very rare to find someone that have been to the more, I'll say, innovative. And the other side is more based on math and more the precise decisions in life. How many of the people in the crowds they have both engineering or something related to this and more innovative design background? Okay, so I see 1, 2, 3. Okay, you see, this is what I'm talking about.
What are these design or engineers?
Both.
Oh,
I ask who has both. Okay, so that's a good point. I think it's very relevant to our market. And we talked about product management. So we all know that one of the fundamental concepts in product management is that there are no cookie cutter solutions. There is no one solution that fits all companies, all domains. So if we're talking about ecosystems, when is it going to fail? What are the cons of either joining an ecosystem or building one if you're the bigger company in the story?
It's a great question. I think there's a number of pitfalls that come into play when you start to think about the where you're going to spend your time. And so one is ultimately the user experience. If you partner up with an ecosystem or set of partners that could deliver a bad experience, and if that's the way your customers find and discover you, then they're going to think that's on you. And so when you think about the whole idea of the weakest link, when you're part of an ecosystem, the ecosystem, every part also fails when some part fails in that too. So I think that's one. I think the other thing is where do you spend your time? So you can spend a lot of time trying to convince a partner, and ultimately that could be wasted if they're not going to go do it, or if you're just spending time selling there. So those are two really I think fundamental things that you could really get burned on. I do think that there's ways to reduce that risk, and fundamentally I think if you can nail what the great experience is going to look like and answer that very tightly, then you back up from there. It will largely, when you go into these conversations, the partner will get sold immediately, because any partner you'd want to work with, they'd say, hey, this is a great experience, the world should have it, it becomes a lot easier. Then you've also set the bar of what has to be built. If it does not cross that, we should not launch it, which then helps go drive the discussion. And I think the third thing that I think about is a risk around ecosystems is, I think when we all go and start building something, we all sit here and think, we're going to build and conquer the world and we're going to own everything. Ultimately you could give the value away as you sort of think about that ecosystem. And I think the way you counteract that is you think about that and what that allows you to do, and actually thinking about what can I rely on partners for, what's core to me, what do I need to do long term, what I'm going to rely on a partner for now, but long term and ultimately going to do, then allows you to say, wait, if I now know and feel comfortable with that, do I even need to spend time on this stuff at all now? And I think that really becomes a focusing exercise that makes you more successful overall, because you then prioritize and work on the right stuff.
Well, prioritizing is the number one tool we have in our toolbox. So as we said, behind ecosystem management, product management, there is both art, there is science. So we are looking for the tips. Okay, so what are the best lessons, best tips you can share with the crowd as for ecosystem management? I'll start with one. From my experience, if you start doing that, building that, before you actually go to the point where you can say, almost 100% you nailed your product market fit, this is not the right time for you. Because unless you got to the point where you can understand what is the core value that you offer, you can share this position with others and you can ask others to join you on this mission. So this is my tip for the crowd. Now it's yours.
I think that's a great one. You're back to this whole idea that the sum of the parts are only as good as the individual parts. If you're the weak link in the equation, you're not only going to not land in the market, but you're also going to burn the bridges for the next time you're trying to say, no, we're ready now. So I think that's one. I would also say the other thing is think in terms of APIs from the beginning. I think it's very easy to get into a mode where you kind of cheat. You kind of build internal APIs. You sort of say, well, I'm going to have a hardware piece here, a software piece here, and I'm just going to code to that. The more you can define that as APIs, the better it becomes to do two things. One is it now becomes really easy to open it up and let partners start to try. And you can do that in an open way. You can literally publish the API. You could do that in a closed way where you hold it back and then give it only to tight partners. But it makes you ready for those conversations the moment it's time to happen. The second thing it does is it makes your internal development actually faster. So it feels faster when you start to say, hey, we're going to just code directly in and we don't have to build this up. But we all know the less dependencies you can create between and allowing teams to move, the better you can get. So it focuses you to firm up the interfaces there. And ultimately, as those two things happen, then you end up in a world where you start to say, let's expose this out, and you find a lot of random use cases that you wouldn't have otherwise had. A good example was when we were creating Up, we did it as an ecosystem. There was an open API. The Internet of Things, while most of our intersections were focused on health, we had partners that did better running apps, so that data would come in, better weight management, so you could step on a scale, that data would come in, et cetera. But what was unique that we discovered is we now have this button that's on the body. So what happens if when you go to bed at night, you could tap to go to sleep to say I'm going to sleep, and then your doors lock? Or what happens if when you wake up in the morning, the lights would come on? Or the Nest would adjust, things like that. And this became, we partnered with SmartThings, which is now a Samsung Next organization. But that whole idea came out of essentially some hackathons that we had done that was enabled through the open API, and then we discovered it and it became core part of their demos in CS. So it was kind of an interesting thing that just connected together.
Go and have more hackathons in your company. Okay, so we are in the era of Product of Things. It's an era of innovation. I think it's more, every day we understand it, it's more about the group effort, less about the solo innovation of each part. And what I'm curious about, and this is a challenging one, do you think that can a company be either too big or too small to join an ecosystem?
I don't think they can be too big or too small. I think depending on the size, you bring a different perspective to it, and you have to balance out your likely bias. I think big companies might come at it from the approach of, well, we're the biggest part, so thus we are the ecosystem. And I think that's dangerous because ultimately as a big company, you're never doing everything. And usually a lot of the more creative and innovative things are coming from places you didn't expect. And so you want to kind of see what the ecosystem creates. But you might not have that perspective when you realize, you have that realization that we're very dominant and we could control the ecosystem. And even that terminology of controlling the ecosystem, your approach has to be one of, we might help prop it up, but you're ultimately it flies out and you don't control it. And so I think that's one. I think from a small perspective, I think you might not realize how much impact you can have, or the fact that no one's going to care if we don't have a lot of users. And I think the reality is you can get disproportionate value of that. You can actually sit on top of other people's user base by filling a very missing need in that. And so I think you should be able to join from any level. And I saw developers building our platform that we actually profiled that were 2 people building something, and literally we put them on the side of the box. And so, I think that is that's the type of thing that becomes possible regardless of size. But I think you just have to think about what your bias is, and is that an actual accurate?
Interesting. So we are based in Tel Aviv, where you can find more startup founders than baristas. You all know what I'm talking about here in the crowd. So with this in mind, let's talk about not just product managers, but product managers in startups. Let's say everyone here in the crowd did their job perfectly. They got their product into an ecosystem they created, built by a large company. And now what is missing for them is the understanding. How will they be the critical product person for that large company they are joining, being a part of their ecosystem? So as the person who've been all over the place with product and small companies and bigger companies, and now on the VC side, like the dark side. So what is this like special sauce of being the critical product person?
That's a great question because it's a career growth question. I think ultimately it really comes down to, I think, about 3 things. That if you want to get bigger and bigger jobs in product, you ultimately have to see scale, product cycles, and variety. And so I'll talk through what each of those means. From a scale perspective, obviously managing a product that's being used by few people is very different than managing a product that is being used by lots of people. Managing a feature is very different than managing a portfolio. And so getting to a scale of what you have managed and the amount of teams and the size of those teams ultimately sets you up to manage larger and larger organizations. I think that's one thing. And part of that scale is you also start to transition from a product owner into a business owner. And that's a big piece. So you start to learn things like P&L and how do you make a market and create markets that didn't exist. So number 1 is scale. Number 2 is product cycles. I think it's very easy to kind of get to this one stage where you're like, hey, I was part of creating this. But if you think about the product cycles, you have to go through creation to launch to refine to scale, and then to innovate and evolve from there. And each of those stages requires a very different set of skills that you lean on. Data of user data doesn't matter as much when you're still creating. You're sort of understanding and observing, but it matters a lot as you're refining and prioritizing. But if you actually want to go scale, it's a different thing. And so your skill set starts to shift, and how you move and motivate and scale teams becomes different. And you really can't learn all that stuff until you've watched product cycles go through that full cycle. And probably the last one I didn't say was end of life. How do you decide when to kill a product? This thing that you put in all this time and effort that really doesn't make sense. Or what if it's actually a product that is thriving, but those product resources would be better on this other thing that's actually a bigger market. So you learn that as you go through product cycles, and you have to just go through launching a number of things. And then the third thing is variety. I think, and what I mean by that is variety of products. Different products, a B2B product acts differently than an enterprise product. A product that is a social network acts different than a hardware software product. How you manage hardware teams, is different than how you manage software teams. So seeing that variety brings a much larger tool set to bear. So you can then come to and say, all right, now I can actually look across a portfolio. This is the right tool to use for this situation, and this is the right team to bring to bear for that.
Okay, so first we got scale, right? To understand what a product in a small company for a few users, how this will be different from a bigger company with not only more users, but many types of users as well. Second would be a true understanding of opportunity of cost, right? What is happening in another dimension, in another world, if you've left this product aside and either took this effort and resources and did something else, or just tweaked it, right? So I agree with you. I think this is the biggest challenge for a product manager, the true understanding of opportunity cost, what is happening in another world when you spend this hour on something else. And the third is variety. Very interesting. So I think it all goes to build stuff, work not as hard as you can, but build true meaningful products that you can actually learn things, new things from each, be exposed to other domains, other fields, different geographies as well. Good points. Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you, Travis. Now we got to your part of tonight, the important task of asking the questions. So who is the brave Israeli in the crowd who is going to ask Travis the hard questions, the one I didn't let myself ask him?
Hi. Is there an ecosystem that is from one of your competitors that you're really envious of? And why?
It's a good question. I think, the question was, is there an ecosystem from a competitor I'm really envious of? Is that? Yep. And why? It's a great question. I think, clearly, I don't know about competitor, but we play obviously in the ecosystems on smartphones, and the app ecosystem is a great example. So what has happened on the smartphones on both iOS and Android is you have all of these apps that are really the core of solving why you want this display in your hand, and so sure. We use it for a phone and use it for messaging and email. But what's amazing to me is if you look, while the phone ships with email, there's thousands of apps in there and I'm, one of these people is constantly looking for a better email experience and a better app to do that. And so, I think that's a place that when I think about, super thriving ecosystems, one that I think really resonates to me. I think the other one that plays around that ecosystem has been the devices that attach. So you think about at a physicality level. We have cases, we have mounts for the car, we have all these things that when you think about it really complete and make it work in a certain situation. To me, those are examples of both a software-based and a hardware-based. And you're now starting to see the connection of those two. You're seeing literally things like software as an app that then requires hardware on the other side, and all of a sudden that whole thing comes together as a system.
Hi. Obviously, as product managers, when we think about building a product, we think about the voice of the customer, who's going to be using this, how they're going to be using it. How do you find that changes when you're not thinking about just a product, but the ecosystem in general? What are some of the challenges or differences in terms of how you found it's better or different to approach it?
I think it's actually the exact same as what you said, which is, the question, if everyone didn't hear, is, as we're sort of building product, we think about the customer at the center of that, and as we start to build with ecosystems, how does it change? Did I catch that right? I think the way you sort of think about the center, that customer at the center, instead of just thinking about the customer of your specific problem set, think about the customer as a person. What else are they doing in their life? And so a good example of this is when we were creating the Jambox as an example. There was zero market for wireless speakers. No one sold wireless speakers. And what we started to look at very closely was what do people do with their phones and their tablets? And do they have phones and tablets? And are they streaming content? What's the content they're streaming? Is it Netflix? Is it Spotify? Pandora? What are those systems that all connect together? So we very deeply understood the person and their entire life, and then started to say, now how do we actually fit into that together? Because in our world, we were saying, in order for anyone to care about a wireless speaker, we need to have them understand Spotify and have a mobile phone and have the speaker, and when those come together, all of a sudden you have this portable music experience, right? And so I think a lot of it really comes down to just thinking more holistically about the people that you're already interacting with and understanding what they're using, and that's where you start to find really the opportunities around the ecosystem, where you say, wow, all these people we're talking to that we want to get to, here's the stuff they're using, and we can leverage that and make that better.
From your experience, building an ecosystem requires a lot of effort, and as a small startup, it's a chicken and egg, right? You need to focus on your product market fit, and putting a lot of business development, partner management before you are ready, and before your partner actually you proved yourself to your partner is a little hard. So when is the right point? You think, okay, building an API, like you said, this you can do from the start. That's not a problem. But investing in creating the ecosystem, when do you think is the right point for a startup?
So I would argue right up front, and I would challenge two ideas in the question. The question was, how do you balance out the time you're spending building your product versus the cost of building the ecosystem and the things around that, and when do you start to implement that? And so, as I said, I would actually argue to do that right up front. And the reason is back to a couple of things. One is, I think the idea that we're going to get somewhere faster. The question is, are you making the right progress, not do you have a lot of activity? And I think that act of actually trying to engage an ecosystem gets you much more focused. So that's one. I find that the number of times where we would go into partner meetings, which by the way are under NDA and all these things, and talk about the stuff that we're trying to do, and they would push back, and that would fundamentally make us think about some core aspect of the product, so we didn't build the wrong thing, actually saved us time in the long term. So it feels like more time, but is actually, I think, getting you to a better product sooner. And then the second thing is, as I said, if you think about APIs very early on, then that cost of support could be as simple as like we've released them, but then it also drives you to be more efficient as you build the product yourself. And so I think if you can actually integrate that ecosystem thinking from the beginning, that API thinking from the beginning, the cost can be very light. Now, I'm not arguing that you should go hire partner managers and all the other things in those early stages. You probably don't need people to do that. It's probably just the combination of the CEO instead of, you all know as product managers or as CEOs, part of it is like, have your idea and go talk to as many people, get the feedback. Well, maybe some of those people are just the partners you want to go interact with. And so it's the same meetings you would otherwise have, just for a different purpose.
How do you stay up to date with different methodologies and different, technologies in this field? Not just, just the latest tech, but also the techniques that you want to use.
So the question, how do I stay up to date with tools, techniques, etc.? I think a lot of that is as you build teams, as you interact with lots of different people, a lot of it's just listening and letting teams explore. So I'm a big believer in alignment and goals, and alignment of outputs we're trying to get, but also allowing teams to be sort of independent and leverage some of their own processes and try things. And so as I've managed teams over time, a lot of times they came and said, hey, we have a better way. And maybe that came from someone who'd worked somewhere else, and we went and implemented that. Maybe it came from one of the people just researching and looking at what other teams are doing. So I think a lot of it's just immerse and connect with the community, and that's personally how I do it. I largely rely on the teams to help inform me and try to empower them to go do what they think is going to make them most efficient to get there, and then I learn from that process of what's working and what's not. I think a lot of it stems from how I sort of think about org structure. I generally think in terms of many, it was sort of pods when I used to do it, but people sort of think about it as the Spotify's popularized the model of squads and tribes. So I'm a big believer in that and setting teams up around that sort of structure. Heavily leverage OKRs. And that sort of becomes the very clear way we set and pace teams and how I check in. And then I use a cadence of check-in to sort of see, all right, how's the team progressing against those OKRs? And so I like to set OKRs on hopefully a yearly basis where we say these are the things we're generally trying to get to, and then on a quarterly basis refine the metrics and adjust around. And then usually on a weekly basis I'm sort of checking in with some round robin set of teams on how they're progressing against those OKRs and any decisions that we need to make. Should we adjust them or not? And I think that at a macro level gets the goals, and then a lot of this process and other stuff underneath I leave to the teams to figure out.
I would like to ask you about the future trends. You are in the Silicon Valley now. And my question here is, the phenomena today is a changing of balance between the big 5 companies, the big 5, 6, maybe Samsung is there in the list. They're eating everything. And the question is there, for a startup, left any real space for building his own ecosystem, or he must join one of the bigs or something? Tell me also about the trends I'm speaking about. Well, autonomous car, blockchain, machine learning. Where are our next place to build our own ecosystem?
So that's a great question, and for those that didn't all hear it, the question is, what are some of the trends going on, and then also with a lot of the power balance shifting to some of the big companies, is there any oxygen left in the room for smaller companies to create in that? I think there's obviously I have a little bit of bias, and if you looked on my LinkedIn profile, I posted why I joined Samsung. A lot of that was because as I started to look at a lot of the ideas playing out, I do believe that a lot of them are starting to feel like features across a lot of things that really can only hit scale if you go and amplify across a lot of things to get to the big scale. So an example is something like IoT at the core and fabric. Of course, everything should be connected, but any one company, I don't think today could go create their own IoT framework. And to get it to really work, you need to have lots of things all turn on so the network was now alive. And I think that's fundamentally what you look at what happened with Smart Things through the where they were through the acquisition into the recent CES announcement, where Smart Things was really the core of every single product being discussed, and now all of a sudden you have this one app that's been announced coming out that will control and consolidate, I don't remember what it was, is 20 to 30 apps into one that can control all these experiences. So to me, that could only have happened at the scale of a Samsung sort of bringing it out there. But that doesn't say that only big companies can go create, because again, that was a company that started out as a startup and then got acquired and scaled in. So I think what we also see as platforms get created, like Smart Things, as there will be lots of individual scenarios that start to play out that you say, hey, someone wants to go focus on switches in a room that are smart switches that have a display panel on that. Like, there's a number of different use cases where companies will build that, and they'll build very thriving businesses, and they don't actually have to worry about how do I get connected to the user and the app interface and all these other things. So I actually think those companies now have platforms to allow them to go scale faster, the same way that as the internet came out, all of a sudden the cost structure became lower and we had this two people in a garage could build a highly successful website. Company like WhatsApp can build an app that with pretty small number of people that gets acquired for many billions of dollars, right? So I think it's just going to shift some of the types of ways you use that, and this is why I think it'll be really important for startups to think about those ecosystems they can leverage and use that to get advantage. When I think about the trends, I also posted about this as part of joining, so if you want a more thoughtful, less jet-lagged answer, there's some data in there. But I think at a macro level, a few things are happening. I think speech as an interface is really just now starting to come to use, and I really don't think we've created mobile computing. We've really just created desktop computing that's portable. The whole way we interact in the world, and people walk down the street looking down like this, that's not how humans interact. And I think speech is a really interesting modality where I'm literally in my kitchen still cooking and I say start a timer, and you'll start to hear things like people are at your front door knowing who they are, interacting and communicating. Call my wife because I need her to get milk while she's on her way home. Those are the types of things that speech is just really, we're only starting to understand what that's going to look like. AR is another thing that's being talked about a lot. The whole man-machine interface of that is to be defined and figured out. And computing and the distribution of it, massive amounts of opportunity as we think about how supply and demand in the world gets connected. Of course, there's big examples of this. Uber has famously been the marketplace that's really shown a lot of that. But if you think about how inefficient the world is in terms of connecting supply and demand on almost everything, I think there's tons of opportunity that becomes possible as soon as you have computing and sensors right at the edge that perfectly know where supply is and where demand is and connect those up. So, those are some trends and things I'm starting to see that I think when you have those types of things that are so foundational, I think they create the opportunity for new types of application, and companies will get created that are very focused on that use case rather than the historical ways we did it.
So the origins of fireside chat is in radio shows. I don't know if you know that. So I kind of feel I need to end this session with a thank you, Travis Bogard, brought to you by Product of Things from Tel Aviv. Thank you, Travis. It's been a wonderful session. I can speak for all the crowd saying that we've learned new things. We got ourselves think in a new ways about product management. It's almost done, not yet. Before we will continue, I want to thank again Samsung Next for having us. I want to thank our photographers in the crowd. We have two super nice photographers. One is here, where is the other one? Thank you very much. Thank you, our video guide, at making sure that other people could enjoy this session in other times. This was Product of Things. If we got you hooked on the challenges of product management for IoT and the other enablers of this domain, other technologies, you are more than welcome to go to our website to learn more, to watch other sessions we have with fascinating other people. You can read, you can join our discussion on our Facebook group, you can follow us on any social media out there. But the most important thing is for you to go and build products that people actually care about. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Travis. Have a wonderful evening. It's dessert time.